All right, so you know how in Agile development, it's all about speed and you have to constantly iterate? It's like always moving.
Yeah.
But what happens to the testing you're doing when the code is changing that fast?
Well, it really is like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly.
And the target is constantly evolving and changing.
Yeah.
And that's where a test suite is so important.
Okay.
A test suite is basically just a collection of tests that are designed to ensure that the software is working the way it's supposed to.
A safety net.
Yeah, you could think of it like a safety net.
It's a safety net that's like...
That's moving.
Yeah, it's like being yanked around while you're trying to grab it.
Constantly shifting.
So I know a lot of developers feel like the test suite is more of a burden than a help.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when they're trying to deal with the rapid changes of Agile.
It's a common struggle.
Yeah.
Because the test suite can become outdated really quickly.
Yeah.
In an environment like that where the code base is constantly evolving.
Yeah, and you start to see things slipping through the cracks.
Exactly. Yeah.
You get bugs and you get delays, and then everybody's frustrated.
Yeah, and nobody wants that.
So let's unpack some of these specific challenges that are highlighted in the source material.
Okay.
And I bet a lot of these are going to sound really familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Frequent code changes.
Yeah.
Breaking tests.
Of course.
It's like every time you fix one problem, you cause like 3 more somewhere else.
It's like a game of whack-a-mole, right?
Totally.
You fix one thing and then another thing pops up.
And it can be really hard to manage.
It really can.
Because every time the code changes, there's that chance that you're going to break a test.
Yeah.
Even if it's a really small change.
Exactly.
Then there's the flaky tests.
Yeah.
The ones that pass sometimes and fail other times.
The worst.
It's like, is my code haunted?
Right.
What's going on?
Is it my environment?
Yeah. And those can be super frustrating.
Definitely.
Because you just don't know if you can trust the results.
Exactly. And it makes you question the whole process.
Right. And then on top of that, we have slow test execution.
Oh, yeah.
Like those suites that take forever to run.
It's the worst.
It's like a traffic jam.
Yeah.
It just stops everything.
It really slows down the whole development process.
And I think it discourages people from wanting tests as often as they should.
Yeah, for sure, because who wants to wait around for that?
Nobody.
So then you end up with more problems down the line.
Exactly. And the final challenge that our source material highlights is lack of ownership.
Yeah.
Now, this one isn't a technical problem.
Right.
But it can cause just as much havoc.
Oh, for sure.
It's like that overflowing inbox that nobody wants to touch.
Exactly. And then things just pile up and get worse.
And then you end up with tests that are outdated.
Right.
Or redundant.
Yeah, and the whole thing becomes unmanageable.
So we've got a pretty good picture of the problem. But our source material doesn't just leave us with problems.
Thank goodness.
They also give us some really good best practices.
That's good.
So the first one is all about keeping your tests lean and focused.
So just the most essential things?
Yeah, like the most important scenarios.
Exactly.
Like they give this really great example in the source material.
Oh, what's that?
Instead of having 10 separate tests to check if your login function works, maybe you just need one really strong UI test, and then you can cover all the other little edge cases with faster unit tests.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So it's all about being efficient and strategic.
Yeah, because you don't want to test the same thing over and over again.
Right, if you can get the same level of confidence with fewer tests.
And using your resources wisely.
Yeah, and that's a principle that applies outside of coding too.
Absolutely.
Like in life in general.
You don't need to do 10 things when you could do one thing.
Right, exactly.
To get the same outcome.
So another best practice that they highlight is categorizing tests based on their execution speed.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So how does that work?
So you have your unit tests, which are the fastest. And they focus on individual pieces of your code.
Gotcha.
And then you have your API tests, which test the interactions between different parts of the application. And then finally, you've got your UI tests, which are the slowest. But they're also the most comprehensive.
So they simulate like
how a real user would use the software.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
So if you group your tests by how long they take to run, you can get more strategic with the testing.
Exactly.
You could run the super fast unit tests all the time.
Yeah, like on every code change to get that really fast feedback.
And catch errors quickly.
Exactly.
And then you can schedule the slower API and UI tests. For maybe like certain points in development or right before a big release.
Exactly. It's like having a safety net with different ayers.
I like that analogy.
Thanks.
And you know, this ties back to the problem of slow execution times.
Yes, it does.
If you can run a bunch of tests quickly and get those results back quickly, It just makes everything flow so much better.
Absolutely. And you're less likely to skip tests when you're under pressure.
Because you don't want to wait.
Right. Because nobody wants to wait for hours for their test to run.
So we've talked about keeping things lean, categorizing tests for speed.
Yeah.
What other best practices?
Well, robust test automation practices are really important.
Okay.
And the source material specifically mentions stable locators.
For UI tests.
Yeah.
So for people who aren't deep into code.
Yeah.
Explain why that's so important.
So imagine you're trying to click a button on a web page.
Okay.
But every time you refresh the page, the button moves slightly.
Okay.
That's what happens when you have unstable locators.
Oh.
So they break really easily. And then you get all these false failures, and you waste a lot of time debugging.
No.
So the idea is to identify elements in a way that's not going to break so easily.
Okay.
When the UI changes.
So use like a unique ID.
Exactly. Yes, so that your test can always find the right element.
So it's like having a good map.
Exactly.
That helps your test find its way.
Even if things change a little bit.
Exactly.
It's like having a reliable guide.
And then another practice that they talk about is mocking dependencies.
Oh, yes. That's a good one.
Now, that one sounds kind of intimidating.
It sounds more complicated than it is.
Okay, so for non-technical people, explain what that means.
So let's say you're testing a function that needs to get some data from a database.
Okay.
Every time you run your test, you have to access that database.
Okay.
Which can take a long time.
Yeah.
And it could also cause problems if the database isn't available.
So you're introducing more points of failure.
Exactly. So what you do is you create a mock version of the database.
Oh.
It's basically a fake database that returns some predefined data.
Gotcha.
So you're isolating the code that you want to test.
And you don't have to worry about the database.
Exactly. And it makes your tests run faster.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's a really useful technique.
So it's like using a stunt double for your code.
That's a great analogy.
So you can test that specific action without worrying about the whole system falling apart.
Exactly. And it makes it much easier to debug.
Because you're eliminating variables.
Right. You know exactly what to expect.
Now, I also see data-driven testing mentioned.
Oh, yeah, that's another important one.
So what is that?
So data-driven testing is all about efficiency.
Okay.
So let's say you have a feature that needs to work for different types of users.
Okay, like an admin user versus a regular user.
Exactly.
Okay.
So instead of writing separate test cases for each user, you can just write one test case.
Okay.
And feed it different user data.
So it's like one test.
Yeah.
But it can run all the different scenarios.
Exactly.
I like it.
It's a really powerful technique.
So you don't have to write 100 different tests.
Right. You can just write one test.
You just change the data that it uses.
Exactly. And it saves you a ton of time.
That's great.
And it also makes your tests more maintainable.
Oh, I see.
Because you only have one test to update.
If you need to make changes.
Exactly.
And this ties back to that whole principle of keeping things lean and not having redundancies.
Absolutely. It's all about working smarter, not harder.
So we've talked about keeping things lean, categorizing for speed, using automation, and using data effectively.
Exactly.
What else do we need to keep in mind?
Continuous review and cleanup are really important.
Okay.
It's like tending a garden.
Okay.
You need to regularly prune the dead leaves and weeds to keep things healthy.
So get rid of the tests that aren't relevant anymore?
Exactly.
Right.
Or refactor them if they need to be updated.
So it's like spring cleaning for your code.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I can get behind that.
And the source material also mentions parallel and selective test execution.
Those sound really fancy.
They are powerful techniques.
Okay, so tell us about those.
So parallel execution lets you run multiple tests at the same time.
Oh.
Which can drastically reduce the overall time it takes to run your test suite.
Oh, that's really cool.
It's like having multiple chefs in a kitchen.
Instead of just one.
Exactly.
With that.
And then selective test execution is about choosing which tests to run based on the changes you made to the code.
So like if I'm just working on this one feature, I don't have to run all the tests.
Exactly. You could just run the tests that are relevant to that feature.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it saves you a lot of time.
So what happens when you encounter one of those tests that just won't pass?
Oh, the dreaded failing test?
Like you try everything and it just keeps failing.
Well, the source material suggests a two-pronged approach. Fix or quarantine.
Okay.
So if the test is failing, because of a bug in the code, then you need to fix the bug.
Okay, makes sense.
But if it's a flaky test, and you can't figure out why it's failing, then you should just disable it for now.
Okay.
And investigate it later.
So you don't want it to hold up the rest of the testing process.
Exactly.
So it's like quarantining a sick plant.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
So you don't infect the rest of them.
Exactly. You want to protect the healthy tests.
So I'm really excited to talk about the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Because we get to look at some real-world examples of how companies like Google and Netflix and even small startups are tackling all of these challenges.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how different companies approach this.
Yeah, because I'm sure Google has a very different approach than a tiny startup.
Absolutely. Their needs and resources are totally different.
Okay, so let's jump into these examples and see what we can learn.
Let's do it.
All right, so we've got those best practices down, but like we promised.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how the big companies are actually doing this stuff.
Okay.
So first up,
Google. Yes.
Famous for just
Massive scale.
Tons of code.
So much code.
What really stuck out to you about how they approach test suite maintenance?
Well, they have millions of tests.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Which is no surprise.
Right.
But they've taken this idea of categorizing tests by speed. And they've categorized them by size.
Whoa.
So they have small tests, medium tests, and large tests.
Oh, okay.
And this determines how often they run them.
So it's like...
The small tests are run constantly, like almost every time the code changes.
So those are like unit tests, probably?
Yeah, primarily unit tests.
Okay.
To make sure that the core functionality is working.
Yeah. Got to catch those small things before they turn into big things.
Exactly.
But what about the larger, more complex tests?
So that's where their infrastructure comes in. They've invested a lot in being able to run thousands of tests at the same time.
Okay.
Using parallel execution.
So they can get through those big tests faster.
Yeah, much faster.
But what's really cool is that they're also using AI.
Oh, yeah. AI is changing everything.
AI for testing.
It's the future.
Tell me more about that.
So they're using machine learning.
Okay.
To try to identify tests that are redundant.
Okay.
Or unnecessary.
So it's like having an AI assistant.
Exactly.
That goes through your code.
And tells you what to get rid of.
Yeah, and says like, these tests are good, these tests are useless.
Right, exactly.
I mean, that would be a game changer.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when you're Google and you have a zillion tests.
You would save so much time and effort.
It's like having an AI quality assurance person.
Right, on your team.
That just tells you what to do.
It's like having a super smart assistant.
I love it.
Yeah.
So Google is obviously like the leader in this whole thing.
Yeah. They're really pushing the boundaries.
Yeah. But now let's switch gears and talk about Netflix.
Okay.
Because they're known for chaos engineering.
Oh, yeah.
Which honestly sounds kind of scary to me.
It's not as scary as it sounds.
Okay.
So the idea is to deliberately introduce failures into your system.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
To see how it responds under pressure.
So you break things on purpose.
Well, it's more like controlled experiments.
Okay.
Where you simulate real-world disruptions.
So like what kinds of things?
So they might shut down servers randomly.
Okay.
Or simulate network outages.
Yeah, things like that.
So it's like you're trying to break things to make sure they don't break when it matters.
Exactly. They want to see how the system handles failure.
I mean, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, it's all about being prepared.
So it's like a stress test for your system.
Yeah, you could think of it like that.
You're making sure it can handle anything.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've talked about Google. We've talked about Netflix. What about the little guys?
The startups.
The startups.
Yeah, they don't have all the resources.
Right. They have to be more scrappy.
So how do they handle all this?
So startups often use something called shift-left testing.
Okay, I've heard of that.
So the idea is to start testing as early as possible.
Okay.
Like right from the beginning of development.
So not waiting till the end to test everything.
Exactly. They integrate testing into the entire process.
So it's like you're building quality from the start.
Right. It's not an afterthought.
I like that approach.
Yeah, it's much more efficient.
And since they're usually working in smaller teams, I imagine it's easier to create that culture of shared responsibility.
Exactly. Everyone is involved in testing.
Not just a dedicated QA team.
Right. Everyone is responsible for quality.
So we've seen how the big companies do it with all their fancy resources. And we've seen how the startups do it with their scrappiness.
Yeah.
It's really cool to see how different organizations approach this.
It is. And you know what's interesting?
Yeah.
Even though those approaches seem really different, they actually share some common threads.
Like what?
They're all about efficiency.
Okay.
Automation and building a culture of quality.
So it's like They're all trying to solve the same puzzle.
Exactly.
But they're using different pieces.
And different strategies.
And I think that's a really important takeaway. There's no one right way to do this.
Exactly. You have to find what works best for your team.
Your context.
And your resources.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier.
Oh, what's that?
AI for testing.
Oh, yes.
Seems like that's still pretty new.
It is. Yeah.
But it has a lot of potential.
So much potential.
So right now we're seeing it used to optimize existing tests and identify potential problems.
Right.
But do you think in the future AI will play an even bigger role?
I think so.
Like actually preventing bugs?
Yeah.
Before they even happen?
I think that's definitely where things are headed.
So instead of reacting to problems, we could anticipate them?
Right. And prevent them.
Oh, that would be amazing.
It'll be a game changer.
Imagine like an AI tool that can analyze your code, your testing patterns, your team's habits.
And then it tells you what to do.
Yeah, and it says like, watch out for this.
Exactly. Or you should change this.
That would be incredible.
It would be like having a crystal ball.
I love it.
Yeah.
So the future of testing is looking pretty bright.
It is very bright.
All right, listeners, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From those nitty-gritty challenges of maintaining a test suite to all those cool innovations that are changing the game.
It's an exciting time to be in software development.
But before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay, I'm ready.
I mean, it's amazing how far we've come with testing software.
It really is.
Like, we've gone from doing everything by hand to automated scripts, and now we're talking about AI that can predict bugs.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
Before they even happen.
It shows how much we care about quality.
Yeah, and how much we're willing to innovate.
To make things better.
And it's not just about the technology either, right?
No, definitely not.
It's about the people.
It's about the culture.
Yeah, like creating a team where everyone understands how important testing is.
Exactly.
And where everyone feels comfortable collaborating.
And sharing ideas.
And celebrating successes.
Yeah, celebrating is important. It helps to build morale.
And it's funny because we were talking about all this complex stuff.
Yeah, like AI and chaos engineering.
But it really comes down to something so simple.
Teamwork.
Teamwork.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good reminder for all of us.
It is.
No matter how fancy the technology gets, we can't forget about the human element.
The human element is essential.
So speaking of humans,
our listeners,
our amazing listener, we want to hear from you.
Tell us about your experiences.
What are some of the biggest challenges you've faced?
When it comes to keeping your test suites healthy.
Have you found any clever solutions?
Or any must-have tools
that have made your life easier?
Share your wisdom with us.
Because we can all learn from each other.
That's right.
So head over to the comments.
And let us know what's working for you.
What's not working.
And what questions you still have.
We might even feature some of your insights in a future episode.
Yeah, we love hearing from our listeners.
So until then.
Happy testing, everyone.
Happy testing.